All right, everyone. Welcome back to Esoterica. I feel strange because I've taken the past couple of weeks off, whatever taking them off means. I've been stacking 3 cords of wood and reading Proclus. So off is a strong term for what I've been doing. But I'm happy to be sort of jumping back on the horse this week by being joined by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Dan Trell, the modern hermeticist. Dan, good to see you, brother.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to come back, and this is my wheelhouse, so I'm happy to be discussing it.
Yeah, I think I was really happy to. I threatened everyone that I was going to do this episode when I first did the episode on university sorcery, and if folks haven't seen that episode, you may want to check it out as well. As sort of a companion to this. This as a commentary. We're going to be going through the actual condemnations one by one with a kind of live commentary because of Dan and I's love of commentary literature. So we're bringing it into the 21st century, and then getting in sort of some of that stuff. So we're going to be going basically line by line through this and kind of talking about the historical, philosophical, magical context to a lot of these condemnations. Because if you've been hanging around esoterica long enough, that one of the things we always reiterate is that condemnations are always indicators of practice. And so if you get a list of 20 odd condemnations, then you're getting a list of 20 odd things that people were up to, probably.
Or derangement.
Or derangement. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's also possible people are just making, things up.
But the evidence doesn't bear that out for
No,
this
right.
in this case.
No, I think the evidence really strongly indicates that these are really close to the bone condemnations that really do speak to what was going on in the university environment at the time. So I guess, Dan, any opening remarks before we jump right in?
Nothing in particular. Probably once we get started, I'll have more to say.
All right. Well, let's jump in. Um, I guess the first thing that I'd want to comment, and Dan and I have a couple of preliminary comments before we get into these texts, is that one of the things that I want to really stress about this is that people have to forget what you think you know about the University of Paris and medieval Christianity and university life at this time. I think if you have any conception of university life at this time, you're thinking of super pious dudes like Thomas Aquinas, and they're just up there being pious, commenting on Peter Lombard's sentences, and they go home and they regret that they ever existed, and they're horrible sinners, and they rinse and repeat wearing their salices and hair shirts. Those people existed, and then everyone else existed beneath them. And those other people are people like the Goliards. These are people who are students, riotous students, killing people, getting into fights, getting their tonsure shaved so they can like get around the law, gambling, engaging in sex work with sex workers. I mean, this is a riotous world. So the world of the 13th century university system, at least in Paris, is anything other than tame. And what we're going to see, I think, as we get into this, is that the fact that these guys are practicing black magic is actually just part of a much larger pattern of just how out of controlly wonderful students and professors were in the 13th and 14th centuries. So this condemnation, I think, in many ways is actually a clear glimpse, a window into what student and professor life was like, much more than imagining Duns Scotus and William of Ockham or Thomas Aquinas sitting in front of the room full of all the masters, deducing the nature of substance and spiritual creatures and God. This gives us a glimpse, I think, in a big way about just how complex religious life was and how much of a continuum there was between observant Catholic Christianity and summoning demons to help you pass school. And that represented a continuum of practice, and many people moved on that continuum, and some people were certainly much more closer to Thomas and much closer to the classroom necromancer than people might think. So, Dan, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I also wanted to add that what we're going to look at is in a way a kind of dark side cast by the liberal arts, the 7 liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium, which are grammar, logic, rhetoric, and then arithmetic, geometry, music, which is the study of proportions, and then astronomy. Because you can't have astrological magic without astronomy. You can't have orations to certain spirits without rhetoric. You can't read without grammar. So a lot of these things, the learned magic, we're going to be reading out of a source book of witchcraft, and this is actually the learned magic of the university schoolmen, and it is very much different from the kind of folk magic that you would get among the cunning men or the cunning women. These are people who are following instructions in books, and there is a kind of intertextual approach to this kind of magic as well, because you don't just resort to one text necessarily, but you probably collect a bunch of texts and are aware of different texts. So that's something worth mentioning, is that this is really the backside of higher learning. There were debates starting from the 10th century onward. We get Petrus Alfonsi in the 11th century talking about it, how the seven liberal arts culminate in, perhaps you could say, an eighth, or a totalizing art that encapsulates all of them. And there were debates as to what this was, but one of the theories put forward was that nigromancia, what we would call necromancy, but is really just dealing with spirits, was the highest form of the liberal arts, or it was the summit of the liberal arts. It was the goal of the sage, to use the language of the Picatrix. So really, that's when we're going through this material, we want to think about this. This is not alien to university life or to academic life, that this is very much part and parcel with it.
Yep, I agree. And I guess one other thing I would say is that the reason why this is in the source book on witchcraft is that this is one of the texts that does begin the process of linking magic with heresy. Because prior to this, magic was just a bad thing you did. It was a sin among other sins that you could get forgiven for. When the transitions beginning made here, following the Bernard Guy and other people, Nicholas Emmerich, by this time period, and we're only about 50 years out from the beginning of the witch trials, the link in the mind of inquisitors and jurists and theologians was that what's going on here is that magic isn't only a sin, it's also a heresy. And that link is going to be super important to the witch trials that are really only about 50 years out from this text. So, Dan, you ready to jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. All right, folks. And also, just FYI, if we don't get through all of them today, we'll pick up in a couple of days and finish them. So we're planning to get through all of them, even if we can't get through all of them today. All right. So this we didn't talk about this. This is just the introduction. We're not going to read this entire introduction, but basically, it's just a sort of a standardized. The university is announcing that we're condemning all this stuff that is going on underneath our nose, and it's all this business of what we would call ritual magic. And sorry if these images aren't the highest resolution, but it is the highest resolution that I could find online.
And I tried to blow them up when we're actually going through them piece by piece. I just wanted to mention what our sources are on this slide. So the translation itself is, I'm pretty sure it's from Brian Levac's translation. It didn't really indicate who wrote the translation, but it's from his source book. So I assume the translations are his own. And then the text itself that we're reading is not from 1398. Right. Contrary to what you would think. I mean, it's the text is dated to 1398, but this printed edition is from 1580 from Jean Baudin.
Yep. It's also worth noting, just as we pass through this, is that one of the earliest people to actually comment on this text was Jean Causon, and
Weyer?
No. So Weyer also, he's the latest. The very end of De Prestiigis is just this text. He's just commenting on this text. But I was thinking of Jean Causon because he's interesting, because he wrote in 1402 wrote an extended version of this text where he condemned magic. But also, people should also know that he was a writer on mystical theology, and he was one of the first university level professors of theology to openly recognize Joan of Arc as being actually inspired by God. So again, notice this is complicated. We have a condemnation of sorcery on the one hand, a same person writing a book on mystical theology, and then the same person acknowledging Joan of Arc as divinely inspired. People are complicated. This is a very complicated world, and so we shouldn't think of these people as just universally bullheaded or something like that. All right. So I guess I'll do the first one, and then we'll just go back and forth, Dan, if that's okay with you.
Sure thing.
All right. The first article is this: that to seek intimacy, friendship, and help from demons by means of magical arts, harmful magical acts, or forbidden invocations is not idolatry. This is an error. Get used to that line. Because the demon is judged to be an undaunted and implacable adversary of God and man. He is incapable of ever receiving any truly divine honor or dominion by participation or by suitability, like other rational creatures that have not been condemned. Nor is God adored in these demons in a sign instituted at his pleasure, nor as images and shrines. I think the big thing that's going on in this one that really jumps out to me is that the error, that the overarching error in this text is the idea that one should not give honor and dignity to demonic beings in the same way that one does to God. And therefore, the heresy that I think really overarchingly is condemned in this text is basically a species of idolatry. And therefore, participating, and that's a deadly sin, of course, and by participating in that, that is what makes one a heretic. A one-off practice could be thought of as sinful, but enduring in this practice is what commits one to a kind of heretical worldview, because you're paying honor to God in a way that, or you're paying honor to demonic beings, spiritual creatures, in a way that's only worthy to God. And of course, it's even worse to say that because these demons are the undaunted and implacable adversary of both God and man. I also like the term participation, right? That's giving us some Platonic Platonic stuff there. But I think that's what part of, in many ways, all of the other commentaries are in some sense a commentary to this first article. And this what's laying down what I think is the fundamentally wrongness of what's going on.
Yeah, and there's also this issue that demons are thought of as liars and deceivers, and they are trying to lead you astray by bringing honor to themselves and to get people to worship them instead of the highest God. And so what this is a violation fundamentally of the first commandment,
right?
Which God forbids idolatry. He forbids anybody to put other gods before him. So the word idolatry itself comes from the Greek word eidolon, which is image, and the word for worship. So it's the worship of images. And we'll see later on in subsequent points is that a lot of these demons are conjured into images. This goes way back to antiquity, and these schoolmen were no strangers to that kind of literature, such as I write here, Augustine's City of God, Book 9, is really all about the demons and how, in Augustine's mind, all of the gods of the pagans, since they are not gods because there is only one God, well, they exist. They are in the mind or in the noetic space, so they must be demons. And it is the deceitful nature of a demon to try and seduce you away from the worship of the one God and to set up worship for themselves. So this is really, we need to keep Augustine, and I'm pretty sure City of God was the most read book during this time, most published, more than Aristotle, more than the Bible. People read City of God. And so I would suggest people to get full context for this afterwards, either go read it. I actually have a reading of this Book 9 of City of God on my channel that you can check out. And it's indispensable context for this. I'm trying to see if there's anything else that I wanted to mention here. No, I think that's good.
Yeah, and also you can't worship God by engaging with these creatures. Like there's an idea in some magical literature that by subjugating them, you're showing that God is in fact in control because you're using divine names to subjugate them.
Yeah.
And this is saying, no, you can't. And we'll see subsequent things like that where it says, no, you can't do the wrong thing for the right reason.
There's also an idea from Augustine that's really important that we need to capture here. And it's an idea that he takes from Neoplatonism, but obviously Neoplatonism would not think up these kinds of prohibitions. And it's the idea that there is a highest good, and to choose a good that is not the highest good is a deficiency of the will. It's actually it's evil to not choose the highest good. So it's not to say that all the demons necessarily are, these kind of satanic, I don't know, Dungeons and Dragons like lords of hell who are trying to seduce you. It's just that they are not manifestations or aspects of the highest good. And so to choose to try to do homage to them or to please them instead of pleasing the highest God is a theological error. Mm-hmm. Your whole life should be focused toward a single highest good, and anything short of that is a mistake theologically. So that is something really important to keep in mind, is this kind of Platonic approach to valuation, and what is the highest thing to value, and how is it a corruption of the will to not value the highest thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, first one down.
Okay, so secundus articulus, quod dare vel offere vel promittere daemonibus qualemcunque res rem ut ampleant ad impleant desiderium hominus aut in honorem eorum aliquid osculari vel portare non sit idolatria error. So the second article, that to give or to offer or to promise demons any sort of thing so that they fulfill the desire of man, even to bear something valued by them in their honor, is not idolatry. This is an error. So this ties into sort of what we were just talking about with Augustine, that there are probably people who would think that what they are doing, the homage that they're paying to these entities, is not idolatry in some way or another. Whether it's because they're not setting up an image, or because they are not worshiping the demons in a way that is prescribed by God, for example, that you would worship God with. So let's say through sacrifices or things like that. To not do these things, or rather to do these things, is idolatry. And that is what this is affirming, that you may think you're not doing idolatry, but actually you are. And that is the law according to the Paris faculty. We need to also remember that these universities had their own court systems. Mm-hmm. They were not beholden to the secular courts, which is why a man with a tonsure was protected by the law of the church and by the laws of the university. They were not subject to the same laws of the land and of the magistrates.
That's why people faked getting tonsures.
Yes.
Yeah, you could just hire a barber to give you a tonsure, and you would have all the protections of being a student and never go to class. Yeah, and I think this is what you said, Dan, is that this is meant to prevent a pure legalistic way around committing idolatry, where you can say, I didn't create an image of, whatever Paimon. I didn't draw a picture of them. I didn't set up an altar to them. I didn't make a statue of him. And the argument here is, it doesn't matter whether you literally worship an actual idol. The issue is if you're interacting with them in a way as to like trade with them, right? If you give, offer, or promise, even those interactions are sufficient enough to count as idolatry. And it's important to note that, to my knowledge, no medieval text of necromancy requires that you visually represent these beings, but whether in pictures or whether in making statues of them or whatever. Most of them have some kind of images representing the deity or representing those beings, whether it's a seal or something. But the church wants to make it very clear, or the faculty wants to make it very clear, that even engaging with them in terms of a do et des, right? I give, so you give, that's constitutive of idolatry, because again, that's the unique purview of God. You give God things, so God gives you things. If you're engaging with a demon in that way, you're across the line.
Yeah, and the idea is that do ut des is the pagan mode of worship, and it is reciprocal, and it is a two-way street. Whereas with God, if we take something like the Book of Job as an example, it doesn't matter what you do or give to God; it's worth nothing, and
Right.
any good that comes to you comes from God, and it's not because of the things that you did or the good that you put out into the world, because bad things happen to good people all the time. And if it were the case that doing good will always mean that you are receive blessings, then why would bad things happen to good people?
Right.
And
And also
Christianity rejects that, and so
right.
that is present here.
Right. It's a theological error to think that God needs anything and that God will give you anything. Like, period. And anything that's asking for something in order to give you something is by definition subperfect and therefore perhaps demonic.
Yeah,
So
it's a perversion of the highest will, or of the will to attain to the highest good.
right. All right, next one.
Mm-hmm.
All right. The third article. To enter an implicit or explicit pact with demons is neither idolatry nor a species of idolatry nor or apostasy. Right? This is an error. And by implicit pact, right, we mean every superstitious ritual, the effect of which cannot be reasonably traced to either God or nature. This one's really interesting, right? Because it's basically ruling out that, look, if you're, and this will be important when we get into thinking about what so-called natural magic, is that the question here, right, is either God's causing things or nature is causing things, or if it's a third cause, it's very likely demonic, because the angels, of course, work directly in the service of God and are an extension thereof of God's power. And so the idea is that if you're making a pact or making a covenant, right, a pactum, right, with anything else, that is again idolatry, because there's nothing worthy of making a pact with, a covenant with, other than God, and therefore, if you do that, then you've crossed the line. The way around this, of course, would be someone like Roger Bacon, right, where they're simply saying, no, we're just manipulating occult forces, and some of those occult forces are tied to astral objects, which might or might not be alive, and might or might not be spiritual creatures. And so you can see in this one, again, so much of the Middle Ages, at least along the fringes of this, is them trying to really push the boundary of what is constitutive of things like astral necromancy. And you read people like Michael Scott or Cecco d'Ascoli, they're really pushing it to the very, I mean, Cecco d'Ascoli pushed it too far and was executed. But they're really saying, look, these are just natural forces that exist. They might or might not be intelligences. They probably are intelligences. And manipulating them to get what we want is no different than manipulating a magnet to make it do something. And the church is simply saying, no, there's actually a line here to be crossed, and that line is pact making. And what's important about this, right, is the idea that one can make a pact is going to be crucially important in the witch trials, because that's really going to be the idea that once you pact with a demon, or once you make a covenant with the devil, you've undone your covenant with God, and therefore you've become part of the reserve satanic army, and you are at that point a recalcitrant heretic. So one can do this implicitly or explicitly, but it doesn't matter whether you do it implicitly or explicitly. It's constitutive of the same kind of theological error.
Yeah. To me, this is also kind of a fossilized snapshot of almost the University of Paris in the 1260s, which is a long time before this time period. But a lot of these decisions had been hashed out when astral magic and different kinds of magic were coming into the university system in the 13th century, especially through Arabic sources.
Mhm.
And people were wrestling with the idea that there are different kinds of magic: natural magic, demonic magic, and so forth. So guys like Roger Bacon were actually pro magic, but only in the idea of natural magic, which would be like manipulating lodestones or doing medicine, healing, that sort of thing. Anything that required invocations or prayers, he said, why don't you just pray? I recall reading a bit in Roger Bacon's, I think it was Opus Tertius, might have been the Opus Maius, where he says that little old ladies with their prayers are more powerful magicians because they go straight to the source instead of people who, go down the chain of command and try to contact people who are um, not the highest good.
Yep. And we'll see later on, right, is that just because you condemned something in 1277 never meant that it went away. By 13 whatever, by the end of the 14th century here, a lot of this stuff is still practiced, and we'll get to gems and other stuff later. So it's really clear that again, they're cracking down not just on ritual magic, ceremonial magic, but also some natural magic stuff too, because it apparently is making them uncomfortable.
Right, because you could have a stone that heals you for some reason, but if you didn't, let's say, inscribe a magic character on that stone, it could be the natural virtue of the stone. And we have lots of works by people like Albertus Magnus who talk about the virtues of different stones, medical or otherwise. But it's when you start engraving them with signs, those signs are thought to be by these people symbols that communicate with demons, that only the demons can understand.
Right.
And therefore you are communing, whether implicitly or explicitly, with demons.
Right. Or compelling nature in a way that's illicit.
Yes, because in their conception of nature, every object, everything has a spirit governing it and can be communicated with through these kinds of means.
Right. Yeah, and that's the idea of compelling God as a theological thing. We also see in Ars Notoria, right, the idea that you can do these rituals and then God will basically like hand you all this knowledge through direct osmosis, or angels will do it. And the problem with Ars Notoria, at least one of the problems, is the compulsive behavior behind it, the theological compulsion, where if you just do this and fast and stare at this long enough, then God is compelled to send the angels to do it. That's a theological no-no, because God can never be compelled to do anything.
Okay, so quartus, quod conari per artes magicas daimones in lapidibus annulis speculis aut imaginibus nomine eorum consecratis vel potius execratis includere, cogere et actare, vel eas vele vivificare, non sit idolatria, error. So, the fourth, that it is not idolatrous to use magical arts or to try to enclose, to force, to restrain demons in stones, rings, or images consecrated, better execrated, to their names, or even to make these objects come to life. This is an error. So in this, we can very much see a survival, if you will, of this idea that goes back to the 3rd century AD and much further back, of course. But we have a text that talks about this, and that's in the Hermetic Asclepius, chapter 24. So if you have your Brian Copenhaver Hermetica on hand, you can go to chapter 24 of the Asclepius at the back, and it has a discussion of animating statues by calling spirits down into him. And so they're saying, look, it doesn't matter if you're compelling demons as if you have the authority over them and you are forcing them to do something like enter a ring or a stone. This to them is a heretical act. It is error to persist in this practice, because it's been written about or written against by all of the church fathers. So if you are going against the church fathers, then you are obstinately in error and unwilling to change your ways. And that is why they will say it's a theological error, because you are supposed to be beholden to the writings of the fathers and their injunctions and exhortations. So this one goes way back, and obviously it's connected to things that were floating around at the time. The Asclepius was a text that was widely used and taught in the universities as a depiction of what ancient pagans believed. And since it was widely commented on by people like Augustine and Lactantius, nobody destroyed it. It was copied and taught in universities. I'm working on a translation of this text and its commentary, the Glossae Super Trismegistum, and there was lots of interaction with these ideas. So it was just that there were some students and people who would read these and go, "Oh, I should do this." And there were lots of books around, things like Picatrix, which were uh, inspiring people to do these things, giving people ritual instructions on doing these things. Picatrix is by no means the only book that did this, but it's definitely one that was starting to gain traction again around this time.
Right. And also, it's not just an error that you haven't like read your church fathers appropriately. It's also an error because you can't do this. Like demons don't really behave you. They're not really actually listening to you. Like Augustine makes an argument that they will appear to do what you say, but they're always like 3 steps ahead of you because they're way smarter than you. And it's all just a long game trap to make you lose your soul in the end. So yeah, they might go in a stone for a little bit, or you might go do something for you, but the long game, right? It's like the 1980s drug dealers, like, hey kids, want some necromancy? Because once they get you hooked, right, then they'll lead you onto the way of into the way of absolute perdition. And so it's not just that you can't. It's not just an error to try it. It's an error to believe that you can actually compel these beings to do this. Like you're not conning them; they're conning you. So the error cuts in 2 ways. So I always like the idea that not only is this a warning to study your Aristotle better or your St. Augustine better, it's a warning that if you think you're conning demons, you're the one being conned.
I always think of like the demons making a Beavis and Butthead kind of laugh, like like going into the gem. That's what I imagine they think the demons are doing when they're in rings or something like that.
Right. Yeah. It's
Say nothing of Sauron and the Lord of the Rings and all of the ideas that Tolkien has of
right.
infusing spirits. He's like Sauron poured his malice into the ring, and I think that this is obviously tying back into these necromantic practices.
Right. And this is the idea that, you have things like the Ring of Gyges that appears to give you power, but really just destroys you.
Mm.
It makes you invisible, but then you sacrifice everything in, your soul for that invisibility. So yeah, I think that the demons are playing the long game, guys. The demons are the house. You're the people at the slots. Don't play the slots. All right. Fifth, quidlictum est, that it is allowed to use magical acts or any kind of superstition prohibited by the church and by God and the church for any moral purpose. This is an error because, according to the apostle, right, evil cannot be done that good may result. I think this is just actually a straightforward, logical argument that you can't do good by doing evil. We have the exact same prohibition in Judaism, right, where you're not allowed to violate a mitzvah to accomplish another mitzvah. So you can't steal an etrog or a lulav to be able to shake it. And so if you steal something, and you can't commit one bad act in order to accomplish another good act, you get no credit for the good one. And so I think the idea here is that you can't magic your way or superstition your way to doing right, because no amount of evil results in good.
Yeah, and the apostle here is Paul, and the verse that is being the subtext of the verse is from Romans 3:8, and there's also you could also think of Jesus when he's being accused by the Pharisees of casting out demons. They say, "Oh, he's doing it in the name of Beelzebub, in the name of demons," and Jesus says, "Well, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Why would demons help you destroy demons?
Right.
My power comes from God."
And this is part of a long arc of using demons against each other. Think of using the demon Pazuzu to scare off the demon god Lamashtu. This was a pretty common idea in the pagan world of setting gods and demons against one another to accomplish things. Just the church basically says no.
Yeah. And then they cover everything in gargoyles.
Yeah. Yeah, gargoyles and grotesques. You have to be careful about because the thing, right, was that or at least the superstition I've heard is that if you make the gargoyles do something like become downspouts, then they're not actually apotreic. They're not functioning as apotreic magic, and therefore it is not using demons to scare off other demons, or jack-o'-lanterns or something like that. So I've heard that putting a candle in the jack-o'-lantern makes it into a lantern, thus making it not an actual talisman. Ditto with gargoyles and grotesques. I don't think
Good
it
thing to
counts.
know if you want to get the mitzvah of Halloween down.
Yeah, exactly. I do like the fact that at the National Cathedral in DC, they added Darth Vader's face to the grotesques. That's great. Any more on this one? You're gonna move to the next one?
I think we're good on this one.
No, it's
Fairly
pretty easy.
straightforward.
Yep.
Okay, so Sextus, quod licitum sit aut etiam permittendum maleficiis repellere, error. So the sixth, that it is allowed and even to be permitted to repel maleficia, or harmful magic, by other maleficia, harmful magic. This is an error. You can't poison a witch. Although perhaps poison, the veneficia approach is a bit of a narrow approach to this word maleficia. If you note, the translator just leaves it untranslated, which I think is an error. But it's because it's difficult to unpack how much is packed into this term. My practice would be just to translate it as sorcery or something like that, and then leave maleficia in brackets for people to say, like, look, this is a really loaded word, and our English word for it is quite limited.
Yeah, and it's also a word in transition, right? Maleficia at this time would mean one thing 100 years before this text. It would mean a completely different thing 100 years after it, because it would be associated exclusively with so-called like witchcraft.
Yeah, it would go from harmful magic to witchcraft, as
right.
in like consorting with the devil in a satanic conspiracy.
Right. And what's happening is it's in that transitional phase. I think that's why Levac is leaving it there, because he's wanting to try to, I guess he's thinking of trying to really show that it's a technical word in transition, but
yeah, it makes sense with all the other works about maleficia in the source book.
Right. And I think it just needs a good footnote as opposed to leaving it in Latin, but whatever. I think that was in many ways the sixth and the fifth are basically logically complementary. They're in some ways the same kind of condemnation, I think.
Yeah, don't fight fire with fire.
Right. Unless maleficia really is in Proposition 6 really is operating as a technical term. It's already transitioned, and therefore that what was the previous one? Magical acts and superstition.
That you evil cannot be done, that good may result from it.
Right.
Yeah, this is kind of a logical corollary of the other one, I guess.
Yep. All right.
So the seventh, septimus, quad aliquiscum aliquo possit dispensare, my bad. What's this? In quocunque casu ut talibus licite utatur, error. So the seventh, that someone can dispense with something in a particular situation in order to use such arts licitly. This is an error.
This one's
I
weird.
don't know what this one's getting at exactly. Yeah. The Latin is kind of vague as well. I mean, what is possit dispensare? Able to dispense with, but
I think this must have to do with Kukukazum. Yeah. It must have to do with like doing maybe like doing things in specific locales, like crossroads or something.
Yeah, maybe.
Like burying things at crossroads was a certain kind of way. It was like a way of working with demons in a way that you didn't have to worship them. You would bury things at crossroads to get stuff. But I'm trying to think of magical manuals that I know in which you would dispense with something in a particular situation, but
Yeah, this one is a bit of a mystery to me.
yeah, I can't think of. It's funny seeing this word error over and over. I keep thinking of you ever play Legend of Zelda Part 2 where the guy says I am error?
What's Legend of Zelda Part 2?
Like the Nintendo one.
Oh,
He's like a shopkeeper and
yeah.
he just says I am error and it's just a it's a misspelling from the Japanese. But that's all he says. I
Yeah.
am error. I think it's supposed to be I am Errol, but it got translated as I am error.
I like how it's just wrong.
No, right. It's
This
much
one
better in
word.
Latin.
There's an implied id est or maybe just est, so it is an error. But I do like the concision of the Latin and how it's like a big red stop sign.
Right. It is nice in the Latin. You don't have to actually do much more than just say error. Um,
Okay,
all
so
right.
octavus or eight. So quod artes magicae et similes superstitiones et earum observationes sint ab ecclesia irrationabiliter prohibitae. Error. So the eighth, the magical arts, similar superstitions, and their practice are unreasonably prohibited by the church.
I love this one.
This is an error. So yeah, the idea that the church is somehow wrong about this, or that they haven't thought it through, or that it is a lack of reason, which in this context means something like restraint. Um, Reason has a sense of holding you back from doing animalistic deeds or brutish things. This is an error if you believe this.
It's funny. This one seemed like the first one, which I don't know about you, Dan, but this clearly makes it seem like that students were or someone was making arguments that this wasn't fair or it was an overreach on the part of the church, which tells me again that someone was making an argument that hey, this is not you're not being reasonable here, guys. We should be able to summon demons and get stuff. Why not? And the church is like, no, like we have good reasons for this. So to me, again, this sort of tells me that the church was getting kickback, or at
Yeah.
least the Paris faculty was, and that no, they had to actually establish, no, we are being reasonable about this.
And you could find verses that would, verses in the Bible, let's say, that could back up your argument that Jesus gives us the power over demons. So why not use that power to fight demons or to compel them to do things or to act or whatnot?
Right.
Because it's very clearly in Scripture that Christians are given power over the demonic world. But then this would fly in the face of all the patristic writings and the writings that say like, look, no, you're being deceived if you think that you're making pacts with. And there's a difference between exorcism and calling down spirits into images or talismans or
Right, and that
rings.
is illicit, right? I mean, and most of the guys who are being practicing a bunch of this stuff, people forget. We think of exorcism as being sort of like the green berets of the church or whatever, but exorcism was a really low down. You could be in the really low orders and really be a relatively novice priest and still be allowed to do exorcisms. Exorcisms were much lower down the pecking order in terms of your ability to do them than doing mass, right? Like doing the mass, he really had to get pretty high up there in order to publicly officiate mass. But anyone with even the sort of most rudimentary acceptance into the lower orders could do exorcisms. And I strongly suspect, and Kiekefer has made this argument, and I think he's right, that stratum of the clerical layer is really where our clerical necromancers are, or in that
Mhm.
relatively low level of semi-professional necromancer or semi-professional exorcists.
And I imagine that misconception derives from the movie The
Yeah,
Exorcist,
yeah,
because the low priest can't do the exorcism, and they got to keep calling up to higher and higher level priests to come and do the exorcism.
right.
Whereas,
Which is a total shift from the way it was in the Middle Ages. I think that is true now. I think it is difficult to get an exorcism, but I think that's a totally post Vatican I, Vatican II.
yeah, because they were probably like strangling mentally ill people and harming people who were not possessed by demons or not declared to be possessed by demons, but were simply ill in some way.
Right.
And so the church said, no, we got to put an end to this. We can't have people thinking that, everybody with mental illness is demonically possessed, because this is going to make us look bad. So
Right.
we need to have people verify and have their verifications verified and have a whole paper trail on why we believe this person is possessed by a demon.
Right. Because you got people, I mean, even through the 20th century, the famous case of, I think, Anneliese Meyer in Germany, she died during a months-long exorcism, starved herself to death, or was starved to death by, I would say, homicidally irresponsible priests. So, but again, I think this is the argument, right? I think that in the same way that you could tame a wild animal to make the wild animal do what you wanted, I think that these guys would say, look, if we can throw the demons out, why not put them to work? Make them find us buried treasure or something. I don't know. But no, the church says, no, we have good reason for this. Stop. Quit asking. All right. Nonus, quod Deus per artes magicas et maleficia duactor compellere demones suis invocationibus obderi error. The ninth, that the magical arts and maleficia lead God to compellere demons to obey his invocations. This is an error. And again, I think that's right, that the idea that you can make God compel demons to do stuff for you. No, you can't make God do anything. God is totally aloof, and no amount of chanting a bunch of stuff in Latin is going to make God make a bunch of demons do stuff for you. I mean, that seems completely, straightforwardly within the realm of, tons and tons of doctrine that would have been well established. Even some Neoplatonic doctrine, you can't compel the one to do anything. It's just not the way the thing works. So, magical arts and maleficia cannot compel God.
Yeah, and this, maybe it's not fair to the Solomonic and Goetic magicians to say that they are doing this, because they are often appealing to God to do such a thing and not forcing him to do such a thing. There would be a distinction made between those two things.
Right.
But clearly there were people who thought that you could compel God to act in such and such a way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it does. I mean, I don't know how you would read that. The induct, right? You can induct God.
Yeah, led into, like, it's
Right.
from ducere, which is a leading verb, and then inducere is to lead him in to do something like that.
Right. Which is somehow even
You could say
more
induce,
wrong.
but
Induce, but some of the idea that you can, again, like, kind of like game genie God to get stuff. Like,
that is an ancient reference.
Yeah, this is just as ancient as as this text. Only several years later.
You have to blow in your game genie, both sides.
You can't just put in random codes because it'll glitch the game all up. Like, no, you have to put the right codes in, the right demonic signatures. That's the way I see so much of this stuff. It's just filtered through my childhood in the 80s. I'm like, oh yeah, the Chaba de Moshe is just a game genie for reality. All right. Let me check the time because I got about 24 more minutes. And folks, like I said, if we're going to get through the whole thing, if we don't get through them today, Dan and I will schedule some time, maybe on Thursday, maybe I thought we said, if you're free.
I think that works.
Okay. We can check our calendars and we'll come back, folks, and we'll finish it another day. We're not going to leave you hanging on.
Yeah, because I think there's like 25 or 6 or
25
7
or so. Yeah. So maybe we'll get through half today and we'll do half next time.
Yeah.
All
okay,
right.
So Decimus, the 10th. Quod thurificationes et suffumigationes, quae fiunt in talium artium et maleficiorum exercitio, sint ad honorem Dei et ei placeant, error et blasphemia, quoniam Deus alias non veniret vel prohiberet. So that the offering of incense, of thurifications, and smoke, suffumigations, performed in the exercise of such arts and maleficia, is in God's honor and pleases him. This is an error and a blasphemy, since God would not otherwise punish or prohibit it. So the idea here is that God is not pleased by, God already is all things, if you will, to use the Asclepius language. So why does he need things like incense or smoke or these kinds of sacrifices? He doesn't. He just wants your gratitude. Um, and so the idea is that using these kinds of incenses like sandalwood or olibanum, or there's all kinds of things that you can burn: flowers, plants, saps, mastic gums, these kinds of incenses. Whether you put them in a thurible, which is thurificaciones, when you're going around and shaking your thurible and you've got smoke billowing out of it, or suffumigations, which is often when you set the fire or the burning material in a censer or something, and have it blow smoke on an image or on a talisman. That these are the generic ways of doing magic in this time period, and simply this is not in God's honor. It's they would argue that the demons want you to do this because demons are pleased by these scents. First of all, they're pleased by the scent of these sacrifices and attracted to them, and they are also pleased by the proportions in which the various substances that are burnt are mixed. Because Augustine, in again this section of the City of God, Book 9, talks about how the demons are pleased by these varying proportions. So if you are doing this for the honor of God, well, error. It's not only an error, but it is also a blasphemy,
Right.
because he punishes it, and he says, look, like, I don't, why, idolatry and superstition is not just believing in things that are not true, but it's worshiping God in a way that he didn't ask you to do it. And so these are the ways that the pagan gods were worshipped. And so the God of Christianity doesn't want to receive these kinds of sacrifices. A lot of Christians were killed in the early centuries because they refused to give a pinch of incense to Caesar or to the divine mind of Caesar. And this was often persecuted. And so the idea is, why would you do that? A lot of people died refusing to do this activity, and here you are saying that God will be pleased by it. So that is why it is here forbidden and blasphemous.
And I think also what adds to the blasphemous character of it is sort of a mockery of the mass, right? That the mass uses suffumigation and other kinds of burning of incenses as part of its pageantry and in a correct way of worshiping God. And again, those are the kinds of things that are done only for God. You would never and this is sort of the great horror, right? The Eucharist could be stolen out of the lockbox and taken and stabbed by Jews or something. And the idea is that no, everything is about the new Christian church reproduces the old temple rituals, but only inside of the body of Christ, i.e., the mass, and therefore doing it somewhere else is inherently a mockery of that. So I think that's what, to me, stretches it not just to being an error, but to being a blasphemy, because it's also a an honor given exclusively to Christ in the mass, but then used as a way of either luring in or showing laud to these demonic beings.
Yeah, and nobody is burning, frankincense at the mass and thinking that God is attracted by the scent and is compelled to act favorably because of it. And that's
Right.
really the difference between the incense offered up at a mass and the incense that's given up in a ritual in, let's say, the Picatrix, where the planetary spirits require these substances to act through.
Right.
And you are essentially, I don't know, like a Cenobite or something. When you twist the box in the right way, and then the Cenobites come. It's this idea that when you get the right proportions and mixtures and weights of these various substances that are pleasing to these entities, that they will come through. That is not what's going on in the mass.
Right. Although it is interesting in the Hebrew Bible, right? God does love the smell of the
Yes.
offerings, right? It's like a barbecue, right? God loves the smell of a good barbecue. And it's also interesting too that in some of the more obscure legal codes, at least in Judaism, one is allowed to use incense to make shadim, like demons, comfortable. This is a clear difference between
Hmm.
rabbinical law and canon law, where these beings, while malevolent, can be engaged with, can be worshipped, but they can be engaged with, and that making them comfortable with certain kinds of incense is actually allowed in some of the more obscure sections of a Jewish legal text, which no one ever talks about for obvious reasons.
Now, is that to appease them to make them like rage less, or is it to drive them out, or is it like what does it mean to calm them more?
Yeah, so it's not to drive them out because that's typically sulfur that you use in those exorcistic rituals, and that's pretty common back to, all the way to PGM.
Yeah, it's
Um,
in the Odyssey where
yeah,
Odysseus wants to clear his house from all the suitors and all of the bad mojo that they brought, so he burns sulfur.
sulfur. Yeah, if you've ever smelled burned sulfur, it'll run you out too. But yeah, I think it has to do with the idea that you're inviting these beings into your proximity, and you have a duty to make them comfortable. It's their guests, and they're dangerous guests, but they're guests. I always think of excuse me. I always think of the way that Judaism thinks about dealing with shadim as sort of the way that you might deal with a mobster. That you don't deal with mobsters normally because that's a bad idea, but you might need to. And so you make them a nice kugel, and
You feed them spaghetti in
yeah, or whatever
your
the custom
mom's.
of the mobsters are that you're dealing with. And these are just sort of spiritual mobsters, and therefore you know have some tea. Like, here's some nice incense.
Right. And it's like
Uh,
the rules of Xenia apply either way, whether
yeah,
to I mean, part of Xenia is practice because you don't know if the person that you're hosting is a god or not.
right. Yeah, and
And
ditto.
and
We have the
so
same
this
idea.
is kind of similar.
Yeah, we have the idea that you should invite random people over to your sukkah because they could be these ushpizim, could be angels in the same way they were for Abraham, right? Abraham didn't know those guys that showed up were angels.
Mhm.
So again, this is an interesting place where canon law and halakha, Jewish law, are very different vis-a-vis interacting with these kinds of beings. All right, I'll read the 11th one. The 11th, that to use such and such, or rather, the 11th, that to use such and do so is not to sacrifice or to make immolations to demons, and therefore it is not damnable idolatry. This is an error. Um,
So the such is referring back to the previous,
yeah,
the
the incense,
purificaciones and suffumigations.
right? And so this it says, right, that by burning something or by burning incense, you are in fact engaging in sacrifices, and making sacrifices to demons is equivalent of sort of worshiping them Hebrew Bible style, Old Testament style, and that is damnable,
Yeah.
damnabilitor idolatare, like damnable idolatry.
Yeah, and the idea here being that you don't need to kill an animal to make a sacrifice. An immolation is like when you burn an animal.
Right.
Um, and this is saying, smoke of plants and this sort of thing. Just because you're not killing an animal doesn't mean you ain't making a sacrifice.
Right. And it's interesting that that's already beyond the pale, even though we know that Picatrix and everything else were requiring animal sacrifices, and surely people were doing it.
People are
Um,
doing it today.
yeah, exactly. And so it's funny that this text is relatively tame when it comes to, the most kind of radical sacrifice you can imagine is burning some incense, when God knows what people were up to. And people are mentioning the fish liver from the Book of Tobit in the comments, which is just one of my favorite stories. The Book of Tobit is so great. Um, I just love that story of running Asmodeus out with the fish liver from the and Raphael, and just hanging out with the angel Raphael. I love that.
Fish liver, eh? It's like, so what if you get like cod liver oil? Do you repel Asmodeus every time you take it?
I don't know. Let's. I think you may have to burn it on a
Mm,
censer.
that would
But
smell terrible.
yeah, I think let's try it and see if we run Asmodeus out. Um, all right, Dan. You want to tackle the 12th?
Yeah, I'm not going to read the Latin just because it's so long in
Yeah.
the interest of time. Okay, the 12th, that sacred words and certain kinds of devout prayers and fasts and cleansings and bodily self control in boys and others, and the celebration of Mass and other types of good works, which are all performed in order to do these arts, that these good works exculpate the evil in the arts and do not rather indict it. This is an error. For by means of such sacred acts, an attempt is made to sacrifice something, even God Himself in the Eucharist, to demons. The demon makes these sacrifices either because he wishes to be honored like the Most High, Isaiah 14:14. That's I mean, Christians would say this is the devil.
Devil, yeah.
I mean, is it the same in Judaism? What is
No, it's just read as
someone exalting themselves?
Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, it's
Yeah,
a prophecy against Nebuchadnezzar the second. So it's just Nebuchadnezzar trying to be the Halel ben Shachar,
the
the,
morning
the
star.
morning star.
Yeah. Okay. So, or because he wishes to conceal his frauds or to trap the simple minded more easily and destroy them more damnably. Uh, yeah. So the idea is that magic is full of good works, that you have to fast. Sometimes you have to give alms. There are various kinds of purificatory aspects of ritual magic. And a lot of people would presumably say, oh, well, this is being a good Christian. Having self control sexually is implied here. So abstaining from sexual activity, abstaining from certain foods, these sorts of things. That by doing these, I would be not guilty of sin, or it would somehow cancel out the sin of idolatry. And this is an error because it is an attempt to sacrifice something. You're giving up a portion of yourself, whether it be your sexuality or your desires. You're sacrificing your desires to eat foods, let's say, and in doing so, you are making a sacrifice to a demon, which violates the first injunction, the first commandment, to have no other gods before God.
I think that these specific set of prohibitions probably have the Ars Notoria in their sites, because the
Mm.
Ars Notoria clicks every one of those boxes in terms of the requirements to it's the initiatory process before one begins the actual invocation process. Every one of those things ticks those boxes. Although the Contintia Corporealis Impueris one really, I wonder if that he translated it of boys, but I wonder if he means of youths, like of students,
I
or
think it's boys, and I think it has to do with sexual abstinence.
of like from having sex with boys or having
No, like
boys
of
having
of
sex.
boys, like young boys who are prone to sexual activity
Right.
and masturbation and things like that, that they would otherwise give that up. I don't know, like No Nut November or something, and
Yeah,
that
no.
you are that is actually damnable because it's a sacrifice to a demon because God didn't ask you to do it.
Right, right. Well, I don't know. But one could not do it because one is a pious Christian. But
Yes.
if one did not do it in order to, if one were doing like whatever no nut November or whatever in order to summon a demon, then that would be you'd be over the line.
Yeah, exactly.
The
It's the thought that counts, or
right.
what is the intention? Are you trying to compel a demon by doing these purifications? I feel like most traditional magic grimoires from this time period all have some form or
Yeah.
other of purification. Like there's no Left Hand Path, Ninth Gate horror movie type stuff where you're supposed to transgress as much as possible to summon demons.
No,
Um,
because they all basically still accept Christianity. I mean, they're like God's really in charge, and you have to you're just using the theological mechanisms available to you through the power of God and Christ to if you can exercise a demon, you can trap one and use them to do stuff.
mhm.
It's a super Christian logic. That's why the interest in medieval Goetic and Solomonic text just boggles my mind in a lot of ways, because I'm like I can't imagine anyone wanting to be this Christian. What's unbelievable to me is not that you can summon demons. What's unbelievable is that anyone would want to be this pious.
Yeah, I mean, I think of some of the Abramelin purifications,
Oh
and
man.
how long and arduous it is.
Although in the original manuscripts, it's not nearly as long as the Mathers
The
one. He like
Mathers version.
doubles the length of time, and the original manuscripts make it so that you can leave and go do work, and it's much less rigorous. They really kicked the rigor up for those Victorians. The Tories needed to really atone for their
Self-flagellate.
yeah. You evil Tories, you have to go lock yourself in a mansion somewhere. All right. Okay, I think we have time for a couple more. That'll get us to about halfway. I think if we do up to 24.
Yep.
Up to 14. All right. The
Yep.
13th. That that by such arts the holy prophets and other saints had the power of their prophecies and performed miracles or expelled demons. This is an error and a blasphemy. I think this is a relatively straightforward one. The idea is that, look, of course we can do magic because prophets and saints got their powers by doing the same thing. So why can't we do that? And of course, the church is going to say, no, they didn't. Like, what are you talking about? The prophets dealt directly with God. That's what prophet means literally. They're speaking on behalf of God, acting on behalf of God. And of course, the saints not only weren't engaging with demons aside from to expel them or resist them, they certainly weren't summoning them to get their magical powers. They were simply conduits through which the divine acted to in the support of the faith of the believers.
Yeah, saints acquire merit through their works, but that merit is not the thing that is compelling the demons or doing that. It's simply that God's holiness, or even just the name of Christ, dispels and commands demons. It's not through sort of a reverse engineering of magic, or it doesn't ride along the same rails, let's say.
Right.
Okay, so 14th.
Yeah, let's wrap up with 14 for today.
Okay, decimus quartus. Quod Deus per se immediate, vel per bonus angelos talia maleficia sanctis hominibus revelaverit, error et blasphemia. The 14th, that God by himself, with no intermediary, or with the good angels, revealed such maleficia to holy persons. This is an error and a blasphemy. So much of ceremonial magic involves the conjuration of angels, the evocation of angels, and the Paris faculty is here saying that, look, there's not going to be angels coming to teach you secrets of the demonic world. If that happens, they aren't angels. They're just fooling you into thinking that they're angels. They're fallen angels whose sole purpose is to deceive you. And so that is really, I imagine, Ars Notoria probably is. There's some Ars Notoria in the sites here, and just other Goetic traditions that involve the invocation of angels to do certain magical works.
Yeah, God and the angels aren't going to teach you to do evil stuff that God forbids. Like, it's like really straight. I think it's one of those like, are you thinking? Like, come on, guys. Like, God's not going to teach you to do things that God forbids you to do. Clearly, these are demons. And I think again, it's just part of the larger arc of all this that I think that. And again, we have to imagine who's probably going to be most likely to be practicing a bunch of this stuff. It's like medieval 15-year-olds. Like, it's going to be people, you're inducted into the University of Paris at 13 or 14. By 14 or 15, 16, you're knee deep in the hardest classes you're going to be in. And that's when you're going to want the most help. And that's when you would likely turn to things like Ars Notoria. And I think they're just trying to tell these basically 15-year-old edgelords, one, don't spend your money at bookshops buying these books that don't work. And two, they don't work because of the theological apparatus that you don't really learn about yet because you're not a master yet. And three, you're going to get yourself in eternal damnation or eternal perdition for this stuff. So again, I think that at some level we have to imagine the audience for this, and I think the audience for this is edgy medieval teens.
Yeah, it's teens. I mean, it was a younger society by and
Yeah.
large, and it's worth mentioning that people often didn't even go past 2 years. Not everybody graduated. Not everybody got the degree or moved on. A lot of people just went to school, they learned what they could, they got a handle for it, and then they go, okay, I think I get it, and then they dropped out. And actually, there's a lot of people who do that now today. I don't know if the people who drop out necessarily get the most out of it, but there are some people who wanted a practical approach, or they had certain skills that they wanted to develop, especially literacy
Right.
and various clerical skills, or build certain connections. And then they said, okay, I don't need to keep going in this to move on to the highest levels. And they would just, I don't even know if you would call it dropping out. They would just leave and carry on with their lives. And then the people who are really trying to get up to the next level and get their degrees, these are probably the types of people who would be willing to do the Ars Notoria type magic, where you stare or inspect at sigils and they will reveal to you the fullness of the knowledge that will be learned in the 7 liberal arts. But, you know, some of the operations are more difficult than just studying. So
Yeah, I would say so.
it's always perplexing that people would resort to some of these rituals when just sitting down and studying would yield better results.
I mean, it does promise you the you would get 7 years of knowledge in 4 months, basically. So that's quite a good, quite a good game if you could play it. I don't know if it seems like it would be a hard 4 months for sure, but yeah, and also people have to remember by 1398 or so, we're also seeing the rise of people who are getting an education at the University of Paris, not to become priests, but to become secular people. They're there to become clerks, like just to like work in the chancellery office at City Hall. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of people, those are the kinds of people that desperately want to skip out as quickly as possible so they can get a job, rubber stamping building codes and stuff. Like, and again, we forget those people existed. There were real estate agents in Paris in 1398 who made a killing.
Charter writers and things
Yeah,
like
charter
that.
writers. Nicholas Flamel is a classic example. He was a guy who worked in real estate, made a boatload of money by investing his wife's money. He made so much money that people were like, he must be an alchemist. And that legend stuck. And so, again, I think the audience for this text is, these are not learned magisters of the institution. This is the learned magisters being like, hey,
Cut it out.
15-year-old, yeah, cut it
Quit
out.
screwing
Like,
around.
yeah, like this is dangerous. Kids can get yourself hurt. Shoot your
Yeah.
eye out.
And another thing is that just touching on the youth of the society, that we're on the heels of the plague.
Yeah.
And the plague wiped out, what is it, a third to half of Europeans. So we're living in a society that had a kind of bottleneck, and people by and large were a lot younger in these generations that followed the plague, which never went away either.
Right. Yeah, and also
about how it goes away, but it doesn't really.
These are the same magisters, by the way, that diagnosed the plague as an astrological condition that would end after a few months.
Yeah.
It didn't.
Yeah, which Petrarch rages against.
Yeah.
That was a big part of his Platonic mindset, was that he was like, look, these people, we need to stop following these people who think that everything is the product of astral influences. We need to follow illustrious Platonic souls who will lead the way into a new golden age.
Yeah, yeah. He got the doctors got a lot of people killed though, because they basically said that, like, I think it arrived in the spring. They said, okay, you'll take the summer off, and then come back in the fall, and everything will be fine. The astrological condition will have passed, and people were forced to come back to Paris at the height of it. I mean, Paris suffered really, really devastating. I think it was like the Black Winter of 1350, I think, because of how they thought what they thought was going on. But anyway, the Masters of Paris. All right, folks. Well, Dan, thanks for coming and hanging out with me and talking about medieval magic.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a blast.
Yeah, I look forward to let's finish it up maybe Thursday. I don't know. Let's check our calendars before I make a definite date. But
let's
also,
say
folks,
tentatively Thursday. Yeah.
Tentatively Thursday. Tentatively same medieval error time, same medieval error channel. So, but also just thanks for folks in the chat and folks who are watching live. I think 250 folks watching two weirdo dudes have a running commentary on medieval magic text. Not bad. So yeah, thank everyone for coming and hanging out, and we'll wrap this up on Thursday. Bli neder, as we would say in Hebrew, without an oath. Don't make an oath. Um,
Can't
and look
open it.
for, yeah, you can't. Yeah, I want to make an oath that I can't keep. And also look forward to Friday, where the first of a two-part series on Lilith is coming out. The first of a two-part series on our friend Lilith. Everyone loves Lilith, so we're talking a real deep dive. I think it'll be over an hour when it's all done.
Wow.
So thank you so much. But other than that, see folks in a couple of days, God willing. It is an error.